There's a specific kind of silence that happens right before something changes the world forever. Not the silence of sleep or Sunday mornings or libraries. A harder silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums like the universe itself is holding its breath. Every person who was alive on September 14th, 2041 remembers exactly where they were when that silence fell. They remember what they were eating, who they were talking to, what stupid, ordinary, beautiful thing they were doing when the sky cracked open and something looked down. Most of them would not survive the year. The ones who did would spend the rest of their lives trying to explain what it meant to be human in those months. The burning months, the running months, the months when Earth stopped being a home and started being a battlefield that nobody had ever trained for, on a map nobody had ever drawn, against an enemy that did not negotiate, did not pause, and did not miss. This is not a story about winning. It is a story about what it costs to refuse to lose. The signal came through a Chilean radio telescope at 3:47 in the morning, local time. DR. Amara Osei was on her third cup of terrible vending machine coffee and her second read-through of a grant proposal she had to submit by Friday when the instruments went sideways. She thought it was equipment failure. She always thought it was equipment failure first. 22 years in astrophysics had trained her to distrust miracles before she trusted machines. She ran the diagnostic twice. The signal was real. It was also not random noise, not a pulsar, not anything in the catalog of known phenomena she had spent her entire adult life memorizing. It was structured, layered. It repeated at intervals that were not natural because nothing natural repeats in prime numbers. Her hands were steady when she picked up the phone. Her voice was steady when she made the call. Later, she would not remember how she kept them steady. Later, she would think it was probably the terrible coffee. Within 6 hours, 17 observatories on 4 continents had confirmed the signal. Within 12, it was classified. Within 24, it was too late to classify anything. They came from the direction of Tau Ceti. That was the detail the internet latched on at first, the detail that got repeated in every breathless social media post and scrambled news broadcast before the government started shutting things down. Tau Ceti, 12 light years away. Close in the cosmic sense. Close enough that when humanity had spent decades beaming radio waves into the dark, some of those waves had reached that system and bounced back changed. Changed by something that had been listening. The first ships broke atmosphere over the Pacific Ocean on a Tuesday morning. There were 43 of them. Each one was roughly the size of a large city. Not a building in a city. The entire city. Indianapolis, Calgary, Birmingham. 43 of those, hanging in the upper atmosphere, catching the light wrong, casting shadows the size of counties onto the ocean below. The shadows were dark in a way that felt intentional, like something that had been engineered to be oppressive. General Yusuf Adeyemi was not a man who frightened easily. He had survived 2 wars and one very hostile Senate confirmation hearing. He stood on the roof of NORAD's backup command center in Colorado, hands clasped behind his back, looking at the ship positioned above Denver, and he felt something he had no military word for. His aide, Captain Rosa Medina, stood beside him with a tablet she kept glancing at and putting down, then picking up again because there was data coming in faster than any human brain could process, and processing it didn't help anyway. How long until they do something? Adeyemi asked. Medina looked at her tablet. Put it down. We don't know if they're going to do something, sir. They flew 12 light years and parked over our cities, Captain. They're going to do something. They did something 40 minutes later. It was not a weapons test or a communication. It was a demonstration. One of the ships, the one hovering above a stretch of the Australian outback where land was empty and red and ancient, simply reached down. There was no beam, no visible energy weapon, nothing cinematic. The ground beneath the ship to a depth of 300 meters was removed. Extracted. Gone. Like someone had pressed a cookie cutter into the earth and lifted it away clean. A hole the size of a small nation. Perfectly circular. Edges as smooth as glass. Sitting there in the Australian red earth while the world watched via satellite. No sound. No warning. No communication. Just a hole. Adeyemi looked at the footage for a long time. "Give me the president," he said. The political response lasted approximately 4 days and accomplished approximately nothing. Every major world government issued statements. 3 attempted communication on frequencies the original signal had used. The ships did not respond. 2 nations scrambled fighter jets. The jets were not shot down. They were stopped. Mid-flight, every electronic system aboard every aircraft within 40 kilometers of any ship simply ceased to function simultaneously. The planes glided back down on emergency manual protocols, landing hard in fields and on highways, pilots white-faced and silent. After that, the jets stayed grounded. Dr. Osei watched all of this from a windowless room in a Geneva facility she had been flown to without being asked. Around her were 48 other scientists from 20 countries, all specialists in various corners of physics, biology, linguistics, xenology, signal theory. They had been assembled the way governments assemble experts in a crisis, which is to say, urgently, chaotically, with more hope than logic. She was the only one who had been awake when the signal first came through. She was not sure if that made her important or just unlucky. "The signal structure," she said on the second day, standing in front of a room full of people who all had more degrees than sleep, pointing at a projection that showed the repeating pattern in layers, color-coded by frequency. "It's not a greeting. Look at the interval compression in the 3rd layer. That's not hello. That's not even a question." Dr. Pavel Ivanenko, a Russian physicist with the kind of eyebrows that implied permanent exhaustion, looked at her projection and then looked at her. "What is it, then?" "A countdown." The room was quiet. Amara pointed at the pattern again. "The prime number intervals. The compression. This is the same structure used in mathematical proof sequences. They're not saying hello. They're saying, we have calculated this. We have accounted for this. This is what comes next." "What comes next?" someone asked from the back. She did not answer that. She did not have to. The ships answered it 7 days after their arrival. They did not begin with the major cities. That was the part nobody had predicted. Every simulation, every war game, every apocalyptic novel humanity had ever produced assumed that aliens with superior technology would begin by obliterating the symbols of power. New York, Beijing, Moscow, London. They began with the infrastructure. Power grids went down across 3 continents in a single hour. Not explosively, not dramatically. They were switched off, the way you'd switch off a light when you leave a room. Clean. Total. The ships moved slowly across the sky, methodically, and wherever they passed, the electrical systems below simply stopped. Water treatment facilities. Hospitals on backup generators that then stopped being on backup generators. Traffic systems. Communication satellites, one by one, blinking out of the sky like dying embers. 600 million people lost power in the first 24 hours. The darkness was the strategy. Not fire, not impact. Darkness. Adeyemi understood it immediately. You do not need to bomb a civilization into submission if you can remove its ability to function. You do not need to kill 1 billion people if the cold and the contaminated water and the chaos do it for you. It was efficient in a way that military planners had nightmares about, because it was the kind of efficient that came from studying your target very carefully for a very long time. The ships had been listening to their radio waves for decades. They knew exactly how dependent humanity had become on the systems they were switching off. The military response was immediate and catastrophically ineffective. Not because the soldiers weren't brave. They were. Not because the commanders were incompetent. Some of them were brilliant. It was ineffective because everything with electronics in it stopped working within 40 kilometers of any ship, and modern warfare runs entirely on electronics. Missiles failed. Drones fell out of the sky before they got close. Radar was useless. GPS stopped existing. Within days, every military force on Earth was operating with the technology of a century ago, running on radio frequencies the ships occasionally let through and occasionally didn't, seemingly without pattern or reason. You cannot fight a precision enemy with blunt instruments in the dark. Medina found Adeyemi in his office at 2 in the morning. which was where she found him most nights now. He was reading paper maps by lamplight. Not ironic. Not retro. Actual paper maps, because paper maps worked. "We have a proposal from a Chinese Joint Command," she said. "Coordinated strike. Every functional artillery unit on the continent. Mass barrage on the ship over Chengdu." Adeyemi looked up. "Outcome projections? We hit the hull. We do no appreciable damage. We reveal our remaining operational positions." A pause. "They recommend it anyway. Because, Medina said, and her voice was careful, the voice she used when she was saying something she personally agreed with but professionally shouldn't, because doing nothing is its own kind of death. He understood that. He ordered the strike. Every artillery piece within range of the Chengdu ship fired at 0600 on October 3rd. The barrage lasted 14 minutes. The ordnance hit the hull of the ship and did exactly what the projections said it would. Nothing visible. No damage. No response. The ship did not move. The ship did not retaliate. What it did was this. It turned on a light. A beam, straight down, 300 meters in diameter, white and total and silent, illuminated the city below for exactly 60 seconds. Then it turned off. Nothing happened. But the message was clear enough that every military analyst on the planet understood it simultaneously. "We know where you are. We know what you did. We chose not to respond. We are not afraid of you." That was the moment Adeyemi stopped thinking about this as a military problem with a military solution. He began making different calls. Not to generals, to engineers, to scientists, to the people who understood systems and infrastructure and the specific fragility of things. He called Amara Osei in Geneva, and he told her he needed everything she had. She told him she had a theory. He told her he was listening. "The ships are not weapons platforms," she said. "They're too big and too slow for that to be their primary function. They're doing what ships do. They're carrying something. Troops, equipment, the actual invasion force. The power shutoffs, the demonstration, that softening. That's pre-landing preparation." She paused. "They're going to land." Adeyemi absorbed this. When enough of us have died from the dark to make the landing easier. He told her he needed a timeline. She said she would build one. Across the world in those first terrible weeks, something was happening that the ships had not accounted for. It was not in any military response. It was not in any government protocol. It was happening in basements and in barns and in the wreckage of server rooms and in the cabs of trucks and in community halls lit by candles, where people who had never spoken to each other before were talking very fast and very seriously about the specific things they knew how to do. A retired electrical engineer in Johannesburg figured out that the ship's suppression field had a frequency floor. Below a certain threshold, simple electronics still worked. Old electronics, pre-digital, vacuum tubes, transistor radios, the kind of technology that humanity had largely abandoned because it was inefficient and clunky and took up too much space. She posted her findings on a forum that was running off a server powered by a hand crank generator. Within a week, people were building radios. Within 2 weeks, there was a network. It was slow, and it was limited, and it crackled with static, and half the messages got garbled, and sometimes you'd transmit for an hour and hear nothing back, and you'd sit in the dark wondering if there was anyone left to hear you. But it was there, invisible to the ships, operating below the threshold of what they had deemed worth suppressing, because they had prepared for a civilization that ran on digital infrastructure. They had not prepared for what happened when that civilization's people reached back into their own history and pulled out the tools their grandparents had used. Adeyemi received his first functioning communication from the South African network on October 19th. His radio operator, a 19-year-old private who had grown up collecting vintage electronics as a hobby and was now possibly the most operationally valuable soldier on the continent, tuned in through 40 minutes of noise and found the signal. The voice on the other end was an old woman. Her name was Dr. Priya Nkosi. She was 81 years old. She had survived 3 coups, 1 famine, and the slow death of 2 oceans. "General," she said, through the static, calm as a stone. "I believe I know how they're navigating. I believe I know their blind spots. Are you interested?" He was very interested. He did not know yet that the old woman on the radio would change everything. He did not know that the answer to 43 city-sized ships hanging in the sky over Earth would come not from a weapon or a strategy, but from a retired electrical engineer who had spent 50 years believing that the most dangerous thing in any system was the assumption that you understood it completely. He did not know any of that yet. He just knew that somewhere in the dark, someone was still thinking. And thinking, it turned out, was the one thing the ships had not prepared for. The first ship began its descent on October 31st. Adeyemi watched it on the horizon from a ridge in the Rockies. No instruments, just his eyes and the cold mountain air and the sound of Medina breathing beside him. The ship was vast and slow and lit from underneath by something that looked almost like fire but wasn't. It moved like something that had never considered the possibility of being stopped. He watched it come down. Then he went back to his maps. There was work to do. The first ship landed in the Gobi Desert. Not crashed, not dropped. It came down with the careful deliberateness of something that had done this before on other worlds and knew precisely how much pressure to apply to the ground. The dust cloud it raised could be seen from space. The impact registered on every functioning seismograph left on the planet. And then the ramp opened. It was a ramp, not a hatch, not a door, a ramp, long and shallow and wide, the kind of architectural choice that implies volume, implies numbers, and the first of them came out. Nobody had a good word for what they looked like. Later, the linguists and biologists who survived would spend years arguing over the taxonomy. In the field, in those first hours, the soldiers who saw them used whatever words they had. Big was the first one. Not tall. Big. The difference matters. Tall is a direction. Big is a presence. They stood roughly 2.5 meters at the shoulder, and they moved in a low, forward-rolling way that suggested their weight was distributed for endurance rather than speed. They wore nothing that looked like armor in any human sense, but their skin, if it was skin, had a quality to it that reminded people of basalt, of compressed things. They carried weapons that nobody could fully describe because the weapons changed shape depending on what they were pointed at. They did not speak. They moved in formations that were perfect. Not military perfect, the practiced imperfection of human soldiers who have drilled 1,000 times and still drift an inch out of line. Geometrically perfect. The spacing between each unit was identical. The angles they held were identical. They moved like a single thing pretending to be many things. And watching them from the ridge above the valley where the first unit spread out, the forward scout, a young Mongolian soldier named Badurden, who was 23 and had been a herder before the army, felt something he could not explain as fear because fear was a fire, and this was ice. He radioed back. His voice was steady. He said, "There are a lot of them." He did not say how many because the number was still growing. What Badurden had discovered, and what Adeyemi confirmed within 48 hours through a dozen crackly vacuum tube radio reports from positions around the 3 landing sites that had opened up so far, was that the invasion force was not what anyone had modeled. The military planners had assumed the ships were troop transports in a traditional sense, that you could count the ships and extrapolate a 4 size and then plan around that 4 size. Clean math. The ships were not troop transports. They were closer to hives. The numbers coming out of a single ship defied the apparent interior volume by any human engineering logic. There was either a spatial component nobody understood yet, or the beings were capable of packing themselves in ways that biological bodies should not permit, or both. Within 72 hours of the first landing, estimates put the ground force at somewhere between 8 and 12 million units, spread across 3 continents. 8 million. All Earth's conventional forces combined totaled roughly 15 million active personnel. On paper, it was nearly even. In reality, it was not nearly even, because human soldiers needed sleep and food and water and communication and supply lines and medical support and morale and rest and all the 10,000 things that kept a human being functional. The beings from the ships needed none of these things in any observable quantity. They did not stop. They did not form camps. They moved in their perfect formations through day and night and rain and cold at the same pace, covering ground with a mechanical relentlessness that wore down the defenders not through combat, but through the sheer exhaustion of trying to keep up, of always being repositioned, always falling back, always needing to sleep while they did not. Adeyemi had one advantage. He knew about it because of Priya and Kosi. The old woman had been right about the navigation. The ships used a form of mapping that was essentially perfect within a certain bandwidth of information. Terrain, structures, large concentrations of human infrastructure. But it had a gap. A narrow gap, but real. The ship's sensors were calibrated for the civilization they had studied. They were exquisitely tuned to the electrical signals of the modern world. The networks, the satellites, the digital transmissions, the heat signatures of data centers and power plants. All of that they could read like print. What they could not read clearly, what fell below their threshold of significance, was the noise of the pre-digital world. A single person in an empty field, navigating by stars, leaving no electronic trace, generated a signal profile that the ship's systems apparently classified as background, as natural, as landscape. Priya had called it the shepherd's gap, because a shepherd moving across a hillside with no electronics, no metal beyond a knife, no powered equipment of any kind, generated almost exactly the same signal profile as an empty hillside. The ships looked for humanity the way humanity looked for itself, through its technology. Remove the technology, and you became, to their instruments, invisible. Adeyemi had about 3 weeks before the ground forces adapted. He used every day. The plan he built was not a military plan in any traditional sense. He had no air cover. He had no functioning armor. He had no satellites, and no GPS, and no drone reconnaissance. What he had was people who knew their own land better than any mapping system, who could move through it in the dark and the cold and leave no trace, and who had been improvising under impossible conditions since the day the ships arrived. He broke his forces into cells, small, disconnected, independently operating. No unit larger than 40 people, each one given a specific task and the authority to modify it on the ground because centralized command was a luxury that no longer existed. Each one communicating through the network of old radios that Priya's discovery had made possible on rotating schedules, brief transmissions, nothing that could be tracked. He gave the cells one collective objective: do not fight them directly. Fighting them directly was a death sentence. Their weapons, whatever those shifting things were, could disable any human technology within range and then simply stop a human body in ways that were not survivable. Trying to engage them in open combat was not brave. It was wasteful. Instead, the infrastructure, not the infrastructure the ships had already destroyed. The infrastructure the ships needed. Because here was the thing that Priya had understood, and that took everyone else longer to see. The invasion force was not self-sufficient in the way it appeared. It didn't need sleep. It didn't need food. But it needed something. The ships were doing something, and that something required resources, and those resources had to come from somewhere, and somewhere was Earth. The beings were not here to conquer. Not in the simple sense of planting a flag and calling the planet theirs. They were here to harvest. The 3 landing sites were not random. They were positioned above the largest known deposits of a mineral that had been identified and mapped and considered uneconomical to mine because the quantities available on Earth were insufficient for industrial use. The ship's initial power shutdowns had been to reduce electromagnetic interference with their extraction equipment. The demonstrations of force had been to suppress resistance long enough to begin the process undisturbed. They weren't destroying Earth. They were strip mining it. And the extraction machinery, vast, anchored, connected to the ships above by conduits that hummed at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth from 2 kilometers away, had to be installed, had to be maintained, had to be staffed by units that couldn't be everywhere simultaneously. That was the gap, not in their weapons, in their logistics. Bad Erden was the first one to test it. Giselle had spent 2 weeks observing the installation going up 40 kilometers east of Ulaanbaatar, mapping the patrol patterns of the units guarding it, noting the frequency and duration of the sensor sweeps, and identifying the 2-minute window that opened every 90 minutes when the sweep was at its farthest arc and the ground-level detection was at its thinnest. 2 minutes. 40 kilograms of shaped demolition charges, placed at the 4 load-bearing points of the central conduit tower. Old-fashioned explosives. Chemical. No electronics. Nothing for the ship's systems to register as a weapon signature. Batard and Cell placed the charges in 11 minutes. They were back on the ridge before the sweep returned. The conduit tower came down at 3:14 in the morning. The explosion was visible from 60 kilometers. The ships did not respond with the speed that direct combat had brought out. There was a pause, a long one by their standards. Almost 12 minutes passed before any units converged on the site. 12 minutes in which Batard and Cell was already 6 kilometers away and moving through terrain that even satellite imaging would have had trouble tracking on a clear day. The cell reported in that night. The radio crackled. Batard's voice was not excited, not triumphant. It was the voice of a man who understood what he had discovered. It worked. In the windowless room, in whatever facility she was in now, she had lost track of which country she was in. Her world had shrunk to a laptop, a radio, and people who brought her bad coffee. Amara heard that transmission and felt something move through her chest that was not quite hope, because hope was a bright thing, and this was darker, heavier, the feeling of a door opening in a very dark room. She began calculating. If every extraction installation could be disrupted on a rotating schedule, if the cells could maintain mobility without triggering the sensor threshold, if the supply disruption could be sustained long enough to force the ships to redirect units from expansion to protection, if the protection burden grew fast enough that the expansion slowed, if the slowing was enough to buy time for the network to grow. If. But if was better than nothing. If was what you built on. The cells multiplied. That was the word people used later, multiplied, because it wasn't recruitment in any organized sense. It was transmission. One cell did something that worked and sent the method through the radio network, and 6 cells tried it, and 5 of them succeeded, and those 5 sent out what they'd learned, and 20 cells tried it. The knowledge propagated the way things propagate in living systems, imperfectly, with variation, with loss, but relentlessly. Things that worked survived and spread. Things that didn't were noted, reported, and discarded. It was evolution, compressed into weeks. The beings from the ships were not stupid. They adapted. They added ground sensors. They changed patrol patterns. They began responding to explosions faster, deploying units that could track heat signatures through terrain that human sensors couldn't penetrate. They killed cells. Not many because the cells were small and dispersed and moved constantly, but some. There were losses that Adeyemi received as brief radio reports. Cell 7, compromised for survivors. Cell 23, no contact for 9 days, presumed gone. Each report a weight he carried without putting down. He did not stop. He could not afford to stop. What he could afford was to learn from every loss the way the cells learned from every success. The enemy's adaptations told him things about their capabilities that no other intelligence source could have provided. When they added heat sensors, it told them the heat sensors were new, which meant they hadn't anticipated needing them, which meant there were other capabilities they also hadn't anticipated needing. When they changed patrol patterns, it told them the patterns were responding to observed threats, which meant they were reactive, which meant they were not omniscient, which meant they had blind spots he hadn't found yet. Priya found another one. She found it at 4 in the morning on the 43rd day after the first landing, in the same way she found everything, by looking at the data longer than anyone else was willing to look at it, and refusing to accept that the anomaly was noise. The conduit systems connecting the extraction installations to the ships above used a resonance frequency for power transmission. The frequency was outside the range of human technology, which was presumably why they had not considered it a vulnerability. But it interacted with certain geological formations in ways that were slightly irregular. Not disruptive, just irregular. The power flow stuttered, microscopically, when the conduit was positioned above specific mineral compositions. She cross-referenced the stutters with the mineral maps. She found a pattern. She called Adeyemi. The installations are not all equally productive, she said. 3 of the 37 active sites are running at approximately 60% of the capacity of the others. The geological substrate is wrong for their equipment. They know this. Look at the unit concentration around the high-yield sites versus the low-yield ones. Adeyemi looked. The high-yield sites had 4 times the defensive concentration. The low-yield sites were comparatively thin. They're prioritizing, he said. Yes. Which means if we can force a resource allocation decision, make the cost of defending the secondary sites high enough that they pull units to the primary ones, we can create larger gaps. And if we hit the primary sites while the gaps exist, then we're not disrupting the operation, Amara said, and her voice in that moment was something that would not leave his memory for the rest of his life. Steady and cold and precise as a scalpel. We're collapsing it. It took 3 more weeks to set up. 31 cells, coordinated through the radio network on a timing sequence that required every cell to execute within the same 4-hour window. No margin, no fallback. If the coordination failed, the plan failed, and the cells were exposed, and the enemy learned too much. There was no way to run a rehearsal. Adeyemi sat with his maps, and his radio, and his 19-year-old operator, and he thought about every way it could go wrong. There were many ways. He thought about them all, and then he set them aside and began issuing orders because the only alternative was to not try, and not trying was not something he was willing to make a habit of. The operation began at 0200 on the 58th day after first landing. Cells 1 through 14 hit the secondary installations. 17 simultaneous explosions across 4 continents. The ships responded exactly as projected, pulling units from the primary sites toward the threatened ones, thinning the defensive lines at the high-yield installations in ways that Amar's models had said would create a window of approximately 90 minutes. Cells 15 through 31 moved in the moment the window opened. Baturdan Cell was assigned to the largest primary installation in Central Asia. He had 9 people. He had 90 minutes. He had charges that his cell had been building and refining and testing for 3 weeks, shaped specifically for the resonance characteristics of high-yield combat structures. He had the gap. The installation came down at 0347. Across the world, in the same hour, 5 other primary installations went dark. The extraction operation, which had been proceeding at a rate the ship's systems were evidently designed to sustain across a span of months, had just lost 40% of its productive capacity in a single night. The ships did something then that nobody had expected. They went quiet. For 11 hours, nothing moved. No patrols, no sensor sweeps, no activity of any observable kind from any of the 43 ships still hanging in the sky over Earth's cities. The silence was so complete and so sudden that the cells held position, breathing carefully, not trusting it. Adeyemi sat in his ridge station in the Rockies with Medina, watching the ship over Denver, which had not moved in 11 hours. "What are they doing?" Medina asked. He thought about Priya and Kosi saying this is a countdown. He thought about the way a mathematical proof sequence worked. Not inspiration, not intuition, but the deliberate processing of new variables that had not been in the original calculation. Recalculating, he said. On the 59th day, the ships rose. All 43 of them, slowly, carrying their shadows up off the land, taking the dark with them as they went. No communication. No explanation. The extraction equipment they had already installed was abandoned in place. Half-functional structures standing in the desert, and the steppe and the plains like very strange monuments to something that had tried and stopped. The ships went back up through the atmosphere in the same orderly formation they had arrived in. They did not fire on the way out. Nobody celebrated, not right away. The cells stayed hidden. The radio network maintained silence. Adeyemi watched the sky for 6 hours after the last ship disappeared before he allowed himself to sit down. Medina sat next to him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Below them, in the valleys and the basements and the community halls and the server rooms, people were slowly emerging, blinking at the sky that was just sky again, starting to think about what came next. The power was still off across most of the world. The infrastructure was still shattered. There were months of death and cold and reconstruction ahead, and the ships had gone home, but they still existed, and everything they had done had shown them something about what humanity would do in response, which was not comfortable information to have floating in the cosmos. But they had gone. Adeyemi finally picked up the radio. He called Priya and Kosi. She answered on the second transmission, through static, clear as ever. "They left," he said. "I know. We have no idea if they're coming back." "No," she agreed. A long pause. The static hissed. Somewhere in the distance, a generator coughed. "Was this a victory?" he asked. Priya was quiet for a moment. "We were unprepared," she said. "We were outgunned." A pause. "We fought anyway." Another pause, longer. "I think the word for that isn't victory. I think the word for that is human." He sat with that for a while. Around him, the night was quiet in the old way, the way nights had been quiet before the ships, before all of it. Not the holding breath silence of September 14th. Just dark and cold and full of the small sounds of things going on with the business of existing, which was what the world did, and what it had done through every terrible thing that had ever tried to stop it. He thought about Battered on his ridge. He thought about Amara in her windowless room. He thought about a 19-year-old soldier who collected vintage radios and an 81-year-old woman who had outlasted 2 oceans. He thought about 40 people or fewer in every cell, moving through dark terrain by starlight, carrying old explosives and older knowledge, reaching back through their own history for tools that a vastly superior civilization had not thought to account for. They had not been prepared for this. They had not been equipped for this. They had nothing clean, nothing permanent, nothing that guaranteed tomorrow. But they had answered a question that had been asked of them in the hardest possible way, and the answer they had given was the one thing the ships had failed to map. You can study a civilization for decades through its transmissions. You can count its satellites and chart its networks and measure the reach of its technology. You can know exactly how dependent it is on the systems you plan to remove. What you cannot know from the outside, from a distance, looking in through the signals it broadcasts into the dark, is what it does when you take everything away. Whether it gives up, or whether it reaches back into its past, and its knowledge, and the terrible stubborn fire in its chest, and figures out a way. The ships had not known. Now they did. Adeyemi set down the radio. He looked up at the sky. The stars were out, cold, and permanent, the same stars that had hung over every generation of every people who had ever looked up and wondered what was out there. Now they knew too. He stood up. There was work to do,